The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor, and for one suspended second, the entire restaurant fell silent. Hannah Reid stood frozen in her second-hand coat, her cheeks burning red, while the man she once loved more than her own life looked at her like she was something he'd scraped off his shoe. He didn't know it yet, but in exactly 6 days, that same man would be on his knees, begging for a mercy that would never come, because the woman he'd just humiliated in front of 40 of Manhattan's wealthiest elite was married to the most feared man in the entire city, and he was about to find out exactly what happens when you destroy the wrong woman's dignity in public. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 7 years before that champagne glass hit the floor, Hannah Reid was 22 years old and working double shifts at a diner in Queens, counting quarters to keep the lights on in the cramped apartment she shared with her dying father. She had grown up poor, the kind of poor that taught her to stretch a single chicken breast across 4 dinners. It's the kind of poor where new shoes were a luxury discussed for months before ever being purchased. Her father, a former construction foreman named Walter Reid, had worked himself into a wheelchair building half the skyline of Lower Manhattan, only to be discarded by the very company that profited from his broken back. Hannah had inherited his stubbornness and his quiet, unshakable dignity, even when the world offered her nothing but scraps. It was in that diner, on a rainy Tuesday in October, that she met Trevor Langley for the first time. Trevor was everything Hannah wasn't. The son of a real estate developer, raised in a Fifth Avenue penthouse, educated at private schools where the tuition alone could have paid off her father's medical debt twice over. He walked into that thing on his phone, laughing at something on his phone, and ordered black coffee with an easy charm that made every waitress in the building stop and stare. But it was Hannah he kept coming back for, week after week, sitting in her section, leaving tips that were embarrassingly generous, asking her questions about her life like he actually wanted to hear the answers. For 8 months, Trevor Langley courted Hannah Reid in secret, meeting her after her shifts, walking her home through streets she knew better than he ever could, listening to her talk about her father's illness with a tenderness that convinced her, foolishly, that love could actually cross the chasm between his world and hers. He told her he loved her in the stairwell of her apartment building, his hands cupping her face like she was something precious, and she believed every word of it. Because at 22, heartbreak hadn't yet taught her that some men only love what's convenient and abandon what becomes a burden. She had no idea that the moment her father's medical bills became public knowledge within Trevor's social circle, everything would change. The end came on a Sunday afternoon, in the lobby of the hospital where her father was being treated for the final stages of his illness. Trevor's mother, a sharp-tongued socialite named Diane Langley, had followed her son there, uninvited and unwelcome, and delivered a verdict that Hannah would never forget. She called Hannah a liability, a gold digger in a waitress uniform, and warned Trevor in front of the entire waiting room, that if he continued this relationship, he would be cut off from the family fortune, entirely, disowned, before his 25th birthday. Hannah watched Trevor's face as his mother spoke, watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, and in that moment, she understood exactly what kind of man he really was. He didn't defend her. He didn't even look at her. Trevor Langley stood in that hospital lobby and let his mother humiliate the woman he claimed to love, and when Diane demanded he choose, he chose in less than 10 seconds. He walked out of that hospital without a single word to Hannah, without a backward glance at the woman whose father was dying 3 floors above them. And 2 weeks later, Hannah learned through a mutual friend that Trevor was already dating someone new, a hedge fund manager's daughter with a trust fund and a Harvard degree. Her father passed away 6 weeks after that, and Hannah buried him alone, with no family, no inheritance, and no illusions left about love. What Hannah didn't know, standing at her father's graveside in a borrowed black dress, was that a man was watching her from a distance. A man who had noticed her months earlier during one of his rare visits to that same Queen's diner. A man whose name struck fear into the hearts of judges, senators, and rival crime families alike. Julian Cross was 34 years old, the head of an empire that stretched from construction conglomerates to shipping ports to real estate holdings that touched nearly every borough of New York City. And beneath the tailored suits and boardroom meetings, he ran an underworld network so tightly controlled that federal agents had spent a decade trying and failing to touch him. Julian Cross was not a man who fell in love easily, if at all. His childhood had been carved out of violence. A father murdered in a rival family's territory dispute when Julian was only 9 years old. A mother who drank herself into an early grave trying to cope with the grief, and an uncle who raised him with the philosophy that weakness gets you killed and mercy gets you buried. By the time Julian inherited control of the Cross organization at 26, after a bloody and calculated takeover that eliminated 3 men who dared to challenge him, he had built a reputation so fearsome that most people in his world referred to him only in whispers, never daring to speak his name directly for fear of drawing his attention. But something about Hannah Reid had cracked something open in him that he thought had died with his mother. He had watched her, unnoticed, refilling coffee cups with tired hands and an exhausted smile that never once turned bitter, even as he overheard fragments of her life: a dying father, unpaid bills, a boyfriend who had vanished, the moment things got difficult. Julian had men who could find out anything about anyone within hours, and within a week of first noticing her, he knew everything about Hannah Reid's circumstances, including the name of the man who had abandoned her in a hospital lobby. Trevor Langley, son of Richard and Diane Langley, heir to the Langley Development Group. Julian didn't approach Hannah right away. He was patient in a way that terrified the men who worked beneath him, a patience honed from years of waiting for rivals to make fatal mistakes before he ever struck. He watched from a distance as her father's condition worsened, as she took on a second job cleaning offices at night, just to keep up with medical bills that no honest wage could ever satisfy, and he watched with a controlled fury that surprised even himself. As Trevor felt her jaw tighten, Cass Langley's engagement to the hedge fund manager's daughter was announced in the society pages, exactly 4 months after he'd abandoned Hannah at her lowest moment. It was at her father's funeral, standing at the edge of the small, sparse gathering of mourners, that Julian Cross finally introduced himself to Hannah Reid. He didn't approach as a predator circling something wounded. He approached with a quiet respect that disarmed her defenses in a way she never expected. He told her he had known her father years ago on a construction site, and that Walter Reid had once done him a kindness he'd never forgotten. It was a lie, carefully constructed, but Hannah, grieving and exhausted and desperate for any small comfort, believed him, and that single conversation at a cemetery became the first thread in a relationship that would reshape both of their lives entirely. What followed was a courtship unlike anything Hannah had ever experienced, careful and deliberate, built on Julian's rare gift for making people feel truly seen. He never once mentioned money, never flaunted the empire he controlled, never made her feel like a charity case or a project to be fixed. He simply showed up, driving her to her night cleaning job when her car broke down, quietly paying off the remainder of her father's medical debt through an anonymous hospital fund that she never traced back to him, sitting with her in silence on nights when grief hollowed her out so completely she couldn't speak. It took nearly a year before Hannah allowed herself to trust him, and even longer before she learned the truth about who Julian Cross really was. The revelation came not from Julian himself, but from a newspaper article. Hannah stumbled across late one night, detailing a federal indictment against several associates of the Cross organization, an indictment that named Julian Cross as a person of interest in an investigation spanning money laundering, extortion, and suspected involvement in the disappearance of two rival businessmen. Hannah confronted him that same night, terrified and betrayed, feeling the ground shift beneath her for the second time in her life. But Julian didn't deny it. He sat across from her at his kitchen table, his voice steady and low, and told her the truth. All of it. The violence, the empire, the blood that stained his family legacy long before he was ever born into it. He told her she was free to walk away, that he would ensure she never wanted for anything for the rest of her life regardless of her choice, that he would understand if the truth of who he was frightened her beyond repair. But Hannah Reid had spent her entire life watching good, honest people get crushed by a system that rewarded cruelty and punished poverty, and something in Julian's honesty, his refusal to lie to her, even when a lie would have been easier, moved her more than any grand romantic gesture ever could. She stayed, not because she was naive about the danger, but because for the first time in her life, someone had chosen her completely, without hesitation, without a mother in a hospital lobby demanding he pick money over love. They married 18 months later in a private ceremony at a vineyard, upstate, attended by fewer than 30 people, none of whom knew Hannah's real background and none of whom would have ever guessed that the quiet, elegant woman standing beside Julian Cross had once served coffee to strangers in a Queen's diner. Julian was meticulous about protecting her from the world he operated in. She was given a new surname for public appearances when necessary, a security detail disguised as household staff, and a life so carefully compartmentalized that even his closest associates knew almost nothing about his wife's past. Hannah Cross existed in the world as an elegant philanthropist, a quiet patron of children's hospitals, a woman whose origins were deliberately obscured behind layers of discretion that only a man like Julian could construct. For 3 years, Hannah lived a life she never could have imagined during those exhausting double shifts at the diner. She oversaw charitable foundations that funneled millions into causes she cared about deeply. Hospitals for children, like the one that had failed to save her father in time, scholarship programs for kids from neighborhoods just like the one she grew up in. She learned to navigate Julian's world with a careful grace, understanding which questions to never ask, which rooms to never enter uninvited, which of his associates deserved warmth and which deserved only cold, distant politeness. She had rebuilt an entire life from the ashes of the one Trevor Langley had abandoned, and she rarely thought of him at all anymore, except in the quiet moments when old wounds occasionally ached beneath newer, deeper happiness. But the universe has a cruel sense of timing, and New York City, for all its millions of residents, has a way of forcing the past and present into violent collision when least expected. It happened at a charity gala for pediatric cancer research, an event Hannah had personally organized, held in the grand ballroom of one of Manhattan's most prestigious hotels, filled with the kind of old money and new wealth that made up the upper echelons of the city's elite. Julian was traveling on business that week, attending to matters in Chicago that required his personal presence, leaving Hannah to host the evening alone, flanked only by her discreet security detail. And the quiet confidence of a woman fully at home. In a world that once would have terrified her, she was standing near the auction tables, discussing a donation with a museum curator, wearing a modest but elegant navy gown, when she heard a voice behind her that made every cell in her body freeze. A voice she hadn't heard in 7 years, but one that her memory had never fully released. She turned slowly, and there he was, Trevor Langley, older now, more polished, his boyish charm hardened into something more calculated and self-satisfied, standing with a beautiful blonde woman on his arm, who Hannah instantly recognized from the society pages as his fiancée, Vanessa Whitmore, heiress to a pharmaceutical fortune. Trevor's eyes swept over Hannah with recognition, then confusion, then something far uglier that made her stomach twist with dread. "Hannah? Hannah Reed!" His voice carried across the small circle of guests near them, loud enough that several heads turned. He looked her up and down with an expression that had once made her feel adored, and now made her feel exposed, like he was calculating the exact value of the dress she was wearing and finding it wanting. "God, I almost didn't recognize you. What are you even doing here? Did you get a job with the catering company or something?" He laughed, and Vanessa laughed with him. A bright, cruel sound that carried through the elegant ballroom like a knife through silk, and for one terrible moment, Hannah Cross felt herself pulled backward through time, back into the trembling, powerless girl she had been in that hospital lobby 7 years ago. Hannah's hands trembled slightly at her sides, but she kept her expression composed, drawing on every ounce of the discipline Julian's world had taught her over the past 3 years. She had faced down federal agents at charity events, navigated conversations with men who'd had blood on their hands and smiles that could freeze a room, and she was not about to let Trevor Langley reduce her to the frightened girl she once was. "I organized this event. Actually," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging beneath her calm exterior. Trevor's smirk faltered for only a fraction of a second before he recovered, waving a hand dismissively, clearly assuming she meant she'd been hired for some minor logistical role, rather than believing she could possibly be a woman of any real standing in this room. "Organized it? Sure," Trevor said, his tone dripping with condescension as he turned, slightly toward Vanessa, clearly performing for his fiancée's benefit now, eager to demonstrate his own social superiority by diminishing the woman standing before him. "Hannah and I used to date, back when I was going through my little rebellious phase. Diner waitress, if you can believe it. My mother nearly had a heart attack." He laughed again, that same cruel sound, and Vanessa's perfectly manicured eyebrows rose with amused disbelief as she looked at Hannah like she was a curiosity, an anthropological specimen from some world she'd never had to visit. "How's your father doing, by the way?" "Still working construction." The question landed like a physical blow, and Hannah understood in that instant that Trevor either didn't know or didn't care that her father had died, that he had asked the question purely as a weapon, a way of reminding her of exactly where she came from in front of an audience of Manhattan's elite. Several nearby guests had stopped their own conversations now, drawn in by the spectacle, and Hannah felt dozens of eyes on her, felt the familiar heat of shame crawling up her neck, the same shame she thought she'd buried forever alongside her father 7 years earlier. "My father passed away," she said quietly, "shortly after you left." For half a second, something like discomfort flickered across Trevor's face, but it vanished almost instantly, replaced by an irritated shrug, as though her father's death was an inconvenient detail disrupting the story he was telling about himself. "Sorry to hear that," he said, in a tone that suggested he was anything but, before turning back to Vanessa with a smile. "Anyway, small world, right? Hannah, you should really see if the catering staff needs help with the champagne service. Looks like they're running a bit behind on the north side of the room." He gestured vaguely toward the servers circulating with trays, and Vanessa let out another sharp laugh, clearly delighted by her fiancé's casual cruelty. It was at that exact moment, as Hannah stood frozen in humiliation before a room full of witnesses, that a server approached, with a tray of champagne glasses, and, in the chaos of the moment, a glass slipped and shattered against the marble floor between them. The same shattering glass that would open this very story. The sound cut through the ballroom's ambient noise like a gunshot, silencing nearby conversations, and in that suspended, mortifying pause, Hannah felt something shift inside her chest, not shame anymore, but a cold, quiet fury that she recognized as distinctly her husband's kind of anger. The kind that didn't scream or shout but calculated and waited. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain who she really was, didn't correct Trevor's assumption that she was hired help, didn't announce her married name or the empire attached to it. Instead, Hannah simply looked at Trevor Langley with a calm, unreadable expression that unsettled him more than any outburst could have, said, "It was good seeing you, Trevor," and walked away with the same quiet grace she'd learned from 3 years of navigating far more dangerous rooms than this one. What Trevor didn't know, as he watched her walk away, with visible satisfaction at having put the poor girl back in her place, was that one of the men standing near the bar, dressed unremarkably in a dark suit, had witnessed the entire exchange and was already reaching for his phone. His name was Marcus Delgado, and he had served as the head of Julian Cross's personal security detail for nearly a decade, a man of few words and absolute loyalty, who had been quietly stationed near Hannah throughout the evening, as he was for every public event she attended in Julian's absence. Marcus had watched the entire humiliating scene unfold, with a controlled stillness that masked the alarm building inside him. And the moment Hannah walked away from Trevor, Marcus discreetly stepped out onto the hotel's terrace, dialed a number that only a handful of people in the world had access to, and waited 3 rings before Julian Cross answered from a hotel suite 400 miles away in Chicago. Something happened. Julian's voice was immediately alert, sharpened by years of instinct that told him exactly when a call from Marcus meant something serious rather than routine. Marcus relayed the entire scene with clinical precision. The recognition, the public humiliation, the mention of Hannah's dead father used as a weapon, the reference to her as catering staff in front of dozens of witnesses, and on the other end of the line, in a hotel room a state away, Julian Cross went very, very quiet. Those who worked closely with Julian knew that his silence was infinitely more dangerous than his anger, that the quieter he became, the more precisely and completely he was already calculating exactly how someone's life would be dismantled. "Get me everything on him," Julian finally said, his voice flat and controlled in a way that made even Marcus, a man who had witnessed things most people couldn't stomach, feel a chill run down his spine. Full financials, business dealings, family connections, everything. And Marcus, make sure Hannah gets home safely tonight, and don't let her know you called me about this. I don't want her worrying. Marcus understood the second instruction perfectly. Julian never wanted Hannah to see the machinery of his world grinding into motion, never wanted her to witness transformation, the transformation from devoted husband to something far colder and more calculating, a transformation that had ended careers, marriages, and in a handful of extreme cases over the years, lives. By the time Julian Cross's private jet touched down in New York 2 days later, cutting his Chicago business trip short by nearly a week, he had already received a comprehensive dossier on Trevor Langley that would have made federal investigators jealous of its thoroughness. Trevor, it turned out, was not the untouchable heir Hannah had once believed him to be. The Langley Development Group, the real estate empire built by Trevor's father Richard over 3 decades, was quietly hemorrhaging money, weighed down by 2 failed luxury condominium projects in Brooklyn and a disastrous overseas investment in Dubai real estate that had collapsed during a regional economic downturn 18 months earlier. More interesting still, Julian's investigators uncovered that Trevor, who had been given increasing control over the family business as his aging father's health declined, was in the final stages of negotiating a desperately needed capital injection from an outside investment group, a deal that would determine whether the Langley Development Group survived the next fiscal year or collapsed into bankruptcy, taking 3 generations of the family's reputation and wealth down with it. The investment group Trevor was courting operated under the deliberately obscure name Meridian Capital Partners, a firm known in elite financial circles for discretion, for asking few questions about the source of their capital, and for demanding significant control in exchange for their investment. What Trevor Langley did not know, Cassidy felt her jaw tighten, and what his lawyers and financial advisors had failed to uncover despite months of due diligence, was that Meridian Capital Partners was, in reality, a shell entity wholly controlled by Julian Cross, one of dozens of similarly obscured holding companies, through which Julian quietly moved capital, acquired distressed assets, and exerted influence over businesses and individuals who never suspected the true identity of the person controlling their financial fate. Julian had built Meridian years earlier, specifically for situations requiring absolute discretion, and now, sitting in his private jet somewhere over Ohio, reviewing the file on Trevor Langley's desperate financial situation, he understood with a cold, satisfied clarity that fate had handed him something far more elegant than mere revenge. He wouldn't need to threaten Trevor Langley. He wouldn't need violence, intimidation, or any of the darker tools available to a man of his position. He simply needed to let Trevor walk directly into a trap of his own making, a trap built not from cruelty, but from the man's own desperate greed and arrogance, and Julian intended to watch every second of it unfold, with the same patience he'd shown while courting Hannah at her lowest, most vulnerable moment years earlier. But first, Julian needed to see his wife, needed to understand exactly how deeply that ballroom encounter had wounded her, because whatever plan he constructed in the coming days would be shaped entirely by what Hannah needed, not by what his own fury demanded. He found her at home that evening, curled on the couch in their penthouse overlooking Central Park, a cup of untouched tea cooling on the table beside her, her eyes distant in a way that told him immediately. The wound from the gala had gone far deeper than Marcus's report had suggested. Julian sat beside her without a word, at first simply pulling her into his arms, letting the silence stretch between them, until Hannah finally spoke, her voice smaller than he'd heard it in years. "For a second," she whispered, "I felt like that girl again, like none of the last 3 years actually happened. Like I was still just some poor waitress he could humiliate whenever he wanted." Julian pressed his lips to the top of her head, his jaw tight with a controlled fury he refused to let her see fully, and told her the only thing that mattered in that moment. "You will never be that girl again," he said quietly. "And I promise you, Hannah, he will understand exactly what he threw away, and exactly what it costs to humiliate my wife in front of a room full of witnesses." Hannah pulled back slightly to look at him, searching his face with the particular wariness she reserved for moments when she suspected Julian's darker instincts were stirring beneath the surface. "Julian," she said carefully, "I don't want you to hurt him, not like that. Promise me." It was a request that put Julian in a rare and uncomfortable position, torn between the primal protective fury demanding retribution and the deep respect he held for his wife's moral code, the very quality that had drawn him to her. In the first place, he considered his answer carefully before speaking, choosing his words with the precision of a man who understood that promises, once made to Hannah, were unbreakable in ways that promises to anyone else in his life were not. "I won't touch him," Julian finally said, and he meant it in the most literal sense. No violence, no threats, nothing that could be traced back to physical harm. "But Hannah, some debts don't require blood to be collected. Some men destroy themselves far more thoroughly than I ever could. If you simply let them." Over the following week, Julian orchestrated a sequence of events with the same meticulous precision he applied to every major decision in his empire, moving pieces across a board that Trevor Langley didn't even know he was playing on. Meridian Capital Partners accelerated its negotiations with the Langley Development Group, offering terms that seemed almost too generous to refuse. A substantial capital injection, favorable repayment structures, and minimal initial oversight that would allow Trevor to maintain the appearance of full control over his family's company. Trevor, drowning in debt and desperate to prove to his aging father and skeptical mother that he could save the business, seized the opportunity with the eager, reckless confidence of a man who had never once faced real consequences for his choices. What Trevor's team failed to notice, buried deep within the hundreds of pages of legal documentation his lawyers reviewed too quickly in their eagerness to close the deal, was a series of contractual clauses granting Meridian Capital Partners escalating control over Langley Development Group assets in the event of specific triggering conditions. Conditions that Julian's legal team had carefully constructed to activate the moment certain financial benchmarks Trevor's company was already dangerously close to breaching were crossed. It was a trap built entirely from legitimate paperwork, invisible to anyone who wasn't looking specifically for it, and Trevor Langley, blinded by desperation and his own inflated sense of invulnerability, signed every page without a second thought. The papers were signed on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room on the 40th floor of a midtown office building, champagne poured to celebrate what Trevor believed was his salvation, his triumphant dawn, his triumphant rescue of the family legacy that would finally silence his father's quiet disappointment and his mother's constant criticism. He shook hands with the Meridian Capital Partners representatives, polished men in expensive suits who smiled and offered congratulations, none of them revealing that the true architect of the deal was sitting 400 miles away, reviewing the signed contracts with a cold, satisfied precision, watching the first domino fall, exactly as he had calculated it would. For 6 weeks, everything appeared to proceed normally. The capital injection stabilized Langley Development Group's immediate cash flow crisis. Construction resumed on the stalled Brooklyn condominium projects, and Trevor basked in a renewed sense of confidence, appearing at industry events with Vanessa on his arm, giving interviews to real estate trade publications about his vision for revitalizing his family's company. He had no idea that every financial report he submitted to his new investment partners was being scrutinized not by ordinary analysts, but by a team hand-selected by Julian Cross specifically to identify the precise moment when Trevor's company would breach the triggering conditions buried within their contract. That moment arrived faster than even Julian anticipated. A third-party engineering audit, quietly commissioned by Meridians as a standard due diligence measure that Trevor's lawyers had approved without scrutiny, revealed serious structural deficiencies in the Brooklyn development project. Deficiencies that Trevor had known about for months but had concealed from investors, choosing to continue construction rather than absorb the cost of proper remediation, a decision that violated multiple clauses within the very contract he'd signed so eagerly. The moment this violation was documented, Meridian Capital Partners was contractually entitled to seize controlling interest in the Langley Development Group, effective immediately, with Trevor's father's signature on the original founding documents doing nothing to pretending documents from the families of Trevor's concealment. Richard Langley, Trevor's father, had been battling declining health for over a year, but the news of his son's catastrophic mismanagement, delivered by lawyers in a tense boardroom meeting that Trevor had desperately tried and failed to prevent, sent him into a state of devastated fury that neither Trevor nor his mother had ever witnessed. Diane Langley, the same woman who had once stood in a hospital lobby and called Hannah Reed a gold-digging liability, now watched in horrified disbelief as her son's arrogance and dishonesty stripped away 3 generations of family wealth and reputation in a single catastrophic boardroom announcement, her carefully constructed social standing crumbling along with everything else. The story broke publicly within days. First in real estate trade publications, then spreading to mainstream business news outlets hungry for a scandal involving old New York money. Headlines detailed the collapse of the Langley Development Group, the structural safety violations concealed for months, the lawsuits from condominium buyers who had put deposits down on units now deemed uninhabitable, and the takeover by the previously obscure investment firm Meridian Capital Partners. He sent her jaw tighten, whose true ownership remained carefully shielded behind layers of legal structuring that even the most determined financial journalists couldn't fully penetrate. Trevor Langley went from being celebrated as the young savior of his family's legacy to being publicly humiliated as the architect of its destruction. All within the span of a single devastating week. Vanessa Whitmore, whose own family had built their pharmaceutical fortune on a foundation of careful reputation management, ended her engagement to Trevor within 72 hours of the scandal breaking, releasing a brief statement to the press expressing her family's disappointment and her decision to focus on her own path forward, language that anyone fluent in the coded speech of Manhattan high society understood as a complete and permanent severing of ties. Trevor found himself, almost overnight, abandoned by the very social circle he had spent his entire life cultivating, the same circle that had once laughed alongside him when he humiliated a diner waitress for the crime of loving him. During a difficult chapter of her life, Julian Cross watched all of this unfold from a careful distance, never once directly interacting with Trevor, never revealing his connection to Meridian Capital Partners, allowing the entire collapse to appear as nothing more than the natural consequence of Trevor's own reckless dishonesty and mismanagement. It was, in Julian's estimation, a far more elegant and complete form of justice than any violence could have delivered. Trevor hadn't been destroyed by an outside enemy he could rage against or blame. He had been destroyed by his own choices, laid bare for the entire city to witness, in exactly the same public fashion he had once used to destroy Hannah's dignity in a hospital lobby 7 years earlier. But Julian was not yet finished, because dismantling Trevor's business empire, however satisfying, did not fully address the deeper wound Trevor had inflicted on Hannah, both in that hospital lobby years ago and in that ballroom just weeks earlier. Julian understood something about revenge that many men in his position failed to grasp, that true justice required more than financial ruin. It required Trevor to fully understand exactly who he had discarded and exactly what he had lost in the process, a realization that Julian intended to deliver personally, in a manner calculated to inflict maximum psychological impact, while never once crossing the line into the physical violence he had promised Hannah he would avoid. The opportunity presented itself 3 weeks after the scandal broke, when Meridian Capital Partners, now the controlling owner of what remained of Langley Development Group, scheduled a formal meeting to finalize the transition of leadership, a meeting Trevor was contractually obligated to attend as the outgoing CEO, overseeing the handover process. Trevor arrived at the meeting expecting to face another team of anonymous corporate representatives, some polished strangers who had negotiated the original deal months earlier. Instead, when he walked into the conference room, he found himself facing a single man seated at the head of the table, a man whose face he vaguely recognized from society photographs he'd seen over the years, but had never paid close enough attention to identify. "Mr. Langley," Julian said, his voice calm and pleasant, in a way that immediately unsettled Trevor far more than open hostility would have. "Thank you for making the time. I wanted to handle this transition personally." Trevor sat down slowly, a creeping unease building in his chest as he studied the man across from him, trying to place exactly why this stranger's composed, watchful presence felt so quietly threatening. Julian let the silence stretch for a long moment, savoring it, before he spoke again, his tone still measured and unhurried. "You don't recognize me, do you? That's understandable. We've never formally met, But you do know my wife." Trevor's confusion deepened into genuine alarm as Julian slid a single photograph across the polished conference table. A photograph from the vineyard wedding 3 years earlier. Julian and Hannah standing together beneath a canopy of string lights, radiant and unmistakable. Trevor stared at the image for a long moment, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing before the realization finally crashed over him with the force of a physical blow. "Hannah," he whispered, and Julian watched with quiet, controlled satisfaction as the color drained from Trevor's face, as 3 months of careful strategy finally converged into this single devastating moment of clarity. "My wife," Julian confirmed, leaning back in his chair with the unhurried patience of a man who had waited years for this exact conversation. "The woman you called catering staff at a charity gala 6 weeks ago. The woman you humiliated in front of 40 witnesses the same week, coincidentally. That you were desperately trying to save your family's company from collapse." "Small world, isn't it, Mr. Langley?" Trevor opened his mouth to speak, but no words emerged. His entire understanding of the past, several months rearranging itself with horrifying speed as he began to comprehend the true architecture behind his company's destruction. "I want to be very clear about something," Julian continued, his voice never rising, never betraying the depth of controlled fury that lived beneath his composed exterior. "I didn't destroy your company because of what you did to Hannah 7 years ago, when you chose your mother's approval over the woman who loved you unconditionally while her father lay dying. I didn't destroy it because of what you said to her at that gala, though I promise you, that mattered a great deal to me. I destroyed it because you built an empire on lies and shortcuts and cruelty, and eventually men like you always destroy yourselves. I simply made sure the timeline was accelerated and that it happened where everyone could watch." Trevor's hands trembled visibly against the conference table, his carefully constructed identity as a confident heir to a real estate dynasty, crumbling in real time before a man whose quiet power made every instinct in his body scream with primal fear. "What do you want from me?" Trevor finally managed to ask, his voice a fraction of its usual arrogant confidence. Julian considered the question for a long moment, studying the broken man before him with something that almost resembled pity, though not quite enough to soften his next words. "Nothing," Julian said simply. "I don't want anything from you, Mr. Langley. I already have everything that matters. I have my wife, who is worth more than every dollar your family ever accumulated across 3 generations. I simply wanted you to understand, before you disappear into whatever smaller, quieter life awaits you now, exactly what you threw away, and exactly who was watching when you did it." Julian rose from his chair, buttoning his suit jacket with the same unhurried precision he brought to every aspect of his life, and paused at the doorway of the conference room to deliver one final observation, delivered not with cruelty, but with the calm certainty of a man stating an undeniable truth. Hannah Reed worked double shifts in a diner to keep her father alive, and she never once complained, never once asked anyone for pity. You had every advantage the world could offer, and you built nothing but debt, lies, and a trail of destroyed relationships. I hope, Mr. Langley, that whatever life you rebuild from this teaches you something your parents never did." He left, Trevor sitting alone in that conference room, staring at the photograph of Hannah's wedding day, finally understanding the full and devastating weight of exactly what he had lost. The Langley Development Group was formally dissolved within the year, its remaining assets absorbed into Meridian Capital Partners' broader portfolio, and quietly redistributed, with a significant portion of the recovered capital anonymously donated to construction worker safety initiatives and pediatric hospital funds, causes that Julian knew would have meant something to Hannah, even though he never told her. the full extent of what he'd orchestrated. Richard Langley passed away 8 months after the scandal broke, his health failing rapidly under the combined weight of his declining condition and the devastating collapse of his life's work. And Trevor, stripped of his inheritance, his social standing, and his fiancée, moved to a modest apartment in New Jersey, taking an entry-level position at a construction firm where, for the first time in his life, he was forced to learn the value of the physical labor his family's wealth had always insulated him from understanding. Diane Langley, once so quick to dismiss Hannah's worth in that hospital lobby years earlier, found herself, in a twist of bitter irony, forced to sell the very Fifth Avenue penthouse she had once used as evidence of her family's superiority. Downsizing into a much smaller apartment where the social circle that once fawned over her invitations now rarely returned her calls. She never learned the full truth of who had orchestrated her family's downfall, never connected the dots between the quiet waitress she had once dismissed as a gold-digging liability and the devastating collapse of everything she had spent her life building. And in some ways, that ignorance was its own quiet punishment, a life spent wondering what exactly had gone so catastrophically wrong. Hannah never learned every detail of what Julian had done to Trevor's company, and Julian never volunteered the full extent of it, honoring his promise that no violence had touched the man, while allowing his wife the peace of not having to carry the full weight of knowing exactly how thoroughly her husband had dismantled her former tormentor's life. She learned only fragments, pieced together from news articles she stumbled across months later. The collapse of Langley Development Group, the broken engagement, Trevor's quiet disappearance from the social pages that had once celebrated him. And she understood, without needing every detail confirmed, that Julian had kept his promise in his own singular way, delivering justice without ever raising a hand. 3 years after that champagne glass shattered against the marble floor of the charity gala, Hannah Cross stood in that same ballroom once again, hosting another fundraiser for pediatric cancer research, this time with Julian by her side, his hand resting protectively at the small of her back as they moved through the crowd together, no longer a secret woman hidden behind careful discretion, but a couple whose partnership had become, in its own quiet way, one of the most formidable forces in the city. She had built her own legacy in those years, expanding her charitable foundation into one of the most respected philanthropic organizations in New York, funding scholarships for young women from backgrounds just like the one she'd escaped, ensuring that girls like the one she used to be would never again have to choose between dignity and survival. She thought of Trevor rarely now, and when she did, it was without the sharp sting of humiliation that once accompanied his memory, replaced instead by a distant, almost clinical recognition of how far she had traveled from that hospital lobby, from that diner counter, from that moment when a shattered champagne glass had threatened to pull her backward into a version of herself she had long since outgrown. She understood, standing in that ballroom, with Julian's steady presence beside her, that the girl Trevor Langley had abandoned no longer existed, replaced by a woman who had built an empire of compassion and resilience every bit as formidable as her husband's empire of quiet, calculated power. Late one evening, nearly 4 years after the gala that had briefly threatened to unravel everything Hannah had built, she and Julian sat together on the terrace of their penthouse, the lights of Central Park stretching out below them, and Hannah finally asked the question she had carried unspoken for years. "Did you destroy him because of me?" she asked quietly. Or because he was going to destroy himself anyway? Julian considered the question with the same careful honesty that had first earned her trust years earlier, refusing even now to offer her a comfortable half-truth. "Both," he admitted. He was already drowning in his own arrogance long before I ever touched his company. I simply made sure he drowned where everyone could watch. The same way he tried to drown you in front of a room full of strangers." Hannah was quiet for a long moment, watching the city lights flicker below them, before she finally spoke again, her voice softer now, carrying none of the old wounds that had once defined so much of her relationship to her own past. "I used to think love meant sacrificing everything for someone. Even your own dignity," she said. "Trevor taught me that kind of love destroys you. You taught me something different." Julian pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple, and for a moment, the most feared man in New York City, a man whose name still made federal prosecutors nervous and rival organizations cautious, was simply a husband holding his wife beneath a canopy of city lights, grateful for a love neither of them had expected to survive the world they'd both been born into. The story of Hannah Reid and Julian Cross never made headlines, never appeared in the society pages that had once mocked her poverty or celebrated Trevor's cruelty, because Julian had spent years ensuring their life together remained shielded from public scrutiny, protected by the same careful discretion that had governed every aspect of his empire. But within the small circle of people who truly knew them, their story became something quietly legendary. Proof that the wounds inflicted by cruel, careless people did not have to define the rest of a person's life. That dignity, once nearly destroyed, could be rebuilt into something far stronger than it had ever been before. And that sometimes the universe delivers justice in ways far more elegant and complete than anyone could have orchestrated alone. Trevor Langley, years later, working steady but unremarkable hours at a mid-sized construction firm in New Jersey, occasionally saw glimpses of Hannah's charitable work in local news coverage. Brief mentions of the Reid Cross Foundation's latest scholarship initiative or hospital donation, and each time, a quiet, unresolved ache settled in his chest, a recognition of exactly what he had thrown away in that hospital lobby years earlier, when his mother's disapproval had mattered more to him than the woman who had loved him without condition or calculation. He never fully understood the true architecture behind his company's collapse, never connected Meridian Capital Partners to the man whose wife he'd once humiliated, and in some strange way, that ignorance became its own quiet, permanent punishment. A life spent wondering, never quite knowing exactly how thoroughly his own cruelty had come back to find him. And Hannah Cross, once a poor waitress counting quarters to keep her father's lights on, once a woman humiliated in a hospital lobby, and again years later in a ballroom full of strangers, built a life so far beyond anything Trevor Langley could have ever offered her, that his abandonment, in hindsight, became the single most important turning point of her entire existence. She had learned, through loss and grief and an unlikely love that most people would never understand, that the people who discard you during your darkest moments rarely deserve the privilege of witnessing who you become afterward, and that sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destruction at all, but simply living a life so full, so meaningful, and so entirely your own, that the people who once tried to diminish you become nothing more than a distant, forgettable memory. Footnotes in a story that ultimately belonged only to you.